It was a quiet morning in the small Israelite village, but for one widow, the calm of the surroundings contrasted with the storm within her. It had only been a few months since her husband had passed away, leaving not only grief, but also a mountain of debt. She now faced the harsh reality of supporting two young children alone, without money, without resources, and with a terrible threat looming over her family. The creditors were about to take her children as slaves to pay off the debt. The dirt roads were bustling, but the widow walked with her head down. In the culture of that time, being a woman was already a challenge. Being a widow was even worse. Without a husband to protect her or provide for her home, she was almost invisible. Even so, she kept a firm face in front of the boys, trying to hide the fear that consumed her from within. That morning, a memory came to her mind. The name of the prophet Elisha. The man of God had already performed great miracles. There were rumors that he had restored a boy's life and purified the water of an entire city. But could he possibly help a simple, uninfluential woman like her? In an act of courage, the widow decided to seek him out. Elisha received her with the calmness characteristic of someone who knows that God is in control. He listened to her story without interrupting. When she finished speaking, her voice was almost a whisper. "All I have in the house is a little oil." That was all. But she had no idea that in God's hands, this would be more than enough. Elisha then gave an instruction that seemed as strange as it was bold. "Go and borrow vessels from all your neighbors, many vessels, and when you return, go into your house, close the door, and start pouring out the oil." The widow left confused, but with a flame of hope lit in her heart. Even without understanding how that little oil could fill so many vessels, she knew that she was facing a unique opportunity. Now, it remained to be seen. Would the neighbors help her? And would she have the courage to obey the instruction without questioning? The village where the widow lived was small, a place where everyone knew everyone's story. Its dirt roads were lined with simple houses, built with stones and thatched roofs. Despite the humble appearance, the atmosphere was full of life, with children running barefoot and vendors offering fruits and breads in wicker baskets. But in that time of crisis, laughter was rare, and the faces of the residents carried an invisible weight. Scarcity had reached everyone. The widow was a simple-looking woman, but with an inner strength that few knew. Despite her hands being rough from constant work, her eyes still carried a maternal tenderness, especially when she looked at her children. They were her reason to keep fighting. Without their father, the boys, aged 8 and 10, had matured too quickly. The older one, Eliab, tried to be strong to help his mother, while the younger one, Joel, often asked questions she didn't know how to answer. On the other side of the village were the creditors, led by a man named Joad. He was known for his rigidity and lack of compassion. To him, debts were debts, and feelings had no place in his business. With resources also scarce, Joad planned to take the widow's sons as servants and recover his losses. The widow knew this, and the idea made her tremble. However, it wasn't just the creditors who shaped the context of the story. The neighbors played a crucial role. Some were generous and willing to help, like Ruth, an elderly woman who had been a widow for years. Others were more critical and indifferent, like a merchant who questioned whether the widow had done something to deserve so much suffering. As she went from door to door, asking for vessels as Elisha had ordered, she faced curious and even hostile looks. But she also found small acts of kindness, like that of a young woman who, without saying anything, placed 3 vessels in the widow's hands. Little by little, she gathered what she needed, even without knowing exactly how that oil would multiply. At that moment, her world seemed divided between the despair of the circumstances and the faith required by a promise she did not yet fully understand. Back in her house, the widow closed the door. As Elisha had ordered, the vessels were scattered on the floor, lined up like little soldiers awaiting orders. Her children were beside her, silent, with eyes full of curiosity and anxiety. She held the jar of oil with trembling hands. What if it doesn't work? She thought, but she didn't dare say it out loud. The prophet had told her to pour out the oil, and she knew it was not the time to doubt. Taking a deep breath, she tilted the jar over the first vessel. To her surprise, the golden liquid began to flow in a steady stream. The first vessel was filled, and the oil still continued. "Pass another," she said, her voice now a little firmer. The boys quickly pushed the next vessel, and the oil continued to flow. With each vessel filled, disbelief gave way to hope. "It's real. It's working," whispered Eliab, with a smile on his face for the first time in weeks. But the conflict was not just physical, it was internal. The widow's mind was in a turmoil. What if the oil ran out before filling all the vessels? What if she was wasting what little she had by believing in something impossible? The battle between her faith and her fears grew with each passing moment. Outside, the atmosphere was also tense. The creditors were already circulating through the village, ready to collect their debt. Jode, the leader, had a serious look. He knew that the widow was unable to pay, but he was determined to take her children as payment. Meanwhile, the neighbors whispered about the situation, divided between pity and distrust. Inside the house, the last jar was being filled. The oil had not yet stopped, but the widow's heart was racing. When the last vessel was filled, the flow ceased. She stood still, holding the small empty jar, while tears streamed down her face. It was a miracle. But there was no time for celebrations. The door was knocked on forcefully, and a voice from outside announced, "Widow, it's time to settle your debt." Now, she would have to face her greatest fears and use what God had miraculously multiplied to rescue her family. While the widow was experiencing the miracle inside her house, outside, rumors began to circulate. Some neighbors, curious, wondered what she would do with so many vessels. "Has she gone crazy?" whispered a man when he saw the vessels being taken into her house. Others, like the generous Ruth, felt at peace for having contributed with the little they had. Ruth, by the way, had a story of faith that she shared with the widow's children. "God always does something new for those who trust in Him," said the old woman as she helped Eliab and Joel arrange some vessels in the house. For the boys, Ruth was a kind of spiritual grandmother, always with words of wisdom and stories of her own survival in difficult times. At the same time, Jode, the leader of the creditors, faced pressure from his own superiors. He had promised to bring the widow's children as slaves if she did not pay the debt. But something in his conscience began to bother him. He remembered the widow's husband an honest man who always fulfilled his obligations before his death. Jode didn't like the idea of separating a mother from her children, but the system they lived in was ruthless, and his reputation was at stake. In addition, the community also had its antagonists. A local merchant who prided himself on his wealth and despised the poor used the widow's situation as an example in his conversations. "This happens to those who don't know how to plan their lives," he would say, ignoring the tragic context of the woman's husband's death. Inside the house, as the widow poured out the oil, Elijah began to realize that something bigger was happening. He saw how each filled vessel seemed to revive his mother's faith. Even though he was young, he understood that there was something supernatural there and began to help with even more enthusiasm. Joel, the youngest, simply smiled, amazed at what he saw. The relationships in the village were becoming intertwined. Some residents decided to stay alert, thinking about how they could benefit if the oil was used to pay the debt. Others, inspired by the widow's courage, began to share food and resources with each other, forming a small network of solidarity. But the tension was far from over. The actions of the creditors and the imminent arrival of the deadline loomed over the widow like a shadow. Each step she took to walk in faith was accompanied by the weight of external judgment and internal doubt. When the last vessel was filled, silence filled the house. The widow, still holding the small empty jar, looked around, incredulous. All the vessels were overflowing with oil, shining in the dim light of the house. Her children began to jump for joy, while she fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She knew she had just witnessed something extraordinary. God had multiplied the little she had. But the miracle came with an immediate challenge. The deadline for paying the debt had arrived, and the creditors were knocking on the door. The widow felt the weight of the moment. What to do now? Elisha had not only prophesied the multiplication, but also instructed her to use that oil wisely. With renewed courage, the widow opened the door and faced Jode. He was accompanied by other creditors and seemed impatient. "Widow, you know why we are here. We don't have time for excuses or stories. Where is the payment?" he asked sternly. The widow, without being intimidated, raised her face. "I have something to offer," she said, calling her children to help carry some vessels full of oil outside. The aroma of fresh oil filled the air, and the creditors were surprised by the quality and quantity of the product. Jode examined the oil and reluctantly agreed to use it as payment for the debt. But the real turning point was not just the fulfillment of the debt. Something bigger was happening. When they took the oil to the market, Jode and the merchants realized that the oil was different. The quality was superior, almost supernatural. The vessels sold out quickly, and the price went up as more buyers became interested. Upon realizing the impact of that miracle, Jode, for the first time, questioned his own actions. He saw how a woman who had every reason to fail demonstrated faith and perseverance. Inspired by this, he decided not only to completely pay off the debt, but also ask the widow for forgiveness for the way he treated her. As the oil continued to be sold, the small village began to change. The people, once divided between criticism and help, were now united by the widow's testimony. Many began to wonder, if God can do this with her, what can He do for us? The turning point was not just financial. It was spiritual. The oil not only saved the widow's family, but also began to transform hearts and restore hope in an entire community. The miracle of the oil quickly became the talk of the entire village. For the widow, the relief was immense. The debt that threatened her family had been paid, and now she had enough to start her life again. But the most surprising thing was the reaction of the community. What began as a response to a woman's despair turned into something much bigger: collective hope. Jod, the stern creditor, began to act differently. After paying off the widow's debt with the oil, he began to reevaluate how he treated other families in similar situations. He realized that his role as a collector could be more just and compassionate. Inspired by the miracle he witnessed, Jod decided to organize a meeting with other creditors to discuss ways to alleviate the debts of those who really had no resources, something previously unthinkable. Inside the widow's house, the atmosphere was one of celebration. Eliab and Joel, her children, were radiant. They not only saw God's miracle with their own eyes, but also actively participated in it, helping to carry the vessels and witnessing the oil being multiplied. For Eliab, the older one, this was a milestone. He began to tell his friends about what God had done for his family and dreamed of one day serving God as Elisha did. Joel, on the other hand, kept asking, "Mom, can God do more miracles like this?" But not all reactions were positive. Some people in the village, driven by envy, began to murmur, "Why did God do this for her? She was just a poor widow." The generous Ruth, upon hearing these comments, did not hesitate to defend her friend. God does not look at what people have, but at what they give to Him in faith. And she gave all she had. In addition, something surprising began to happen in the local market. The widow's oil, recognized for its exceptional quality, began to attract buyers from neighboring villages. This brought an unexpected flow of income to the entire village, strengthening the local economy. The small miracle of one family turned into a great movement of blessings for everyone around. The widow, now free from her debts, began to use the remaining resources to help other people facing difficulties. Her testimony was powerful. "God not only saved me, but gave me more than I could imagine." She knew that the oil was not only to solve her problems, it was to be an example of what God could do when we trust in Him. With the vessels of oil now empty, but her heart overflowing with gratitude, the widow began to see her life in a completely different way. The miracle she witnessed not only solved the financial crisis, but also deeply transformed her faith and purpose. Before, she was a woman consumed by fear and uncertainty, living each day with the weight of debt and insecurity. Now, she understood that God not only cared about her needs, but was also able to act in surprising ways. If He could multiply the oil, He can do anything, she thought. This certainty brought a renewed courage to face future challenges. Okay, here's the translated text, adjusted for a YouTube video format. But the growth wasn't just spiritual. The widow realized that the oil also opened doors to a new phase in her life. With the money from the sales, she bought seeds and started a small olive tree farming business, ensuring her family's long-term livelihood. More than just a source of income, it became a way to symbolize the miracle. Every time she cared for her olive trees, she remembered what God had done. Eliab and Joel also grew impressively after the miracle. They began to actively participate in village activities, helping not only their mother, but also others who were going through difficulties. Eliab, inspired by Elisha, began to accompany the prophet on some of his travels, learning about faith, compassion, and obedience to God. Joel, the youngest, dreamed of one day planting his own olive trees and spreading the oil to more people. The widow became an example of overcoming and faith in the village. Her story began to attract people from other regions who wanted to hear about the miracle of the oil. She always shared her testimony with humility, reminding everyone that the true miracle was not in the oil itself, but in the God who multiplied it. Furthermore, her new outlook on life led her to become involved in community projects, helping other widows and orphans. She created a small support network where she shared not only material resources, but also words of encouragement and faith. The community as a whole also grew from the experience. The widow's story united the residents, who learned about generosity and solidarity. Even those who had previously criticized her began to admire her courage and faith. Now, stronger and more confident, the widow faced the future with hope. She knew that as long as she remained obedient to God, He would continue to care for her and her family. After the successful sale of the oil and the repayment of her debts, the widow felt an enormous weight lifted from her shoulders. But she knew that the true purpose of the miracle was not just to ensure her survival, but to transform her story and her community. Now, with resources in hand, she began to plan a future that honored the God who had acted on her behalf. Her first decision was to gather her children and share with them the lessons she had learned. Sitting around the simple wooden table, with the children watching intently, she said, "This oil wasn't just for us. God showed us that He is able to do much with the little we offer Him. Now we need to use this to help others." Eliab, always attentive and curious, replied with a sparkle in his eyes, "Mom, how can we do that?" This conversation started a new journey for the family. The widow decided to use part of the money to buy empty jars and distribute them to others in the village. Each jar came with a message of faith, with the phrase, "God can fill what is empty." For many, this was more than a simple gesture. It was a powerful reminder that God still performed miracles. Meanwhile, Elisha, the prophet, returned to the village to check on how the family was doing. He was impressed to see how the miracle had impacted not only the widow, but the entire community. People began to testify about how her generosity had touched their lives. The prophet took the opportunity to teach the village about the importance of trusting in God, even in desperate situations. However, there were those who were not happy with the widow's prosperity. Some merchants, who profited by exploiting the needy, began to conspire against her. "This miracle is devaluing our oil," they complained. They believed that her fame threatened their businesses. This brought tension to the village, creating an atmosphere of anticipation about what would happen next. Even so, the widow was not intimidated. With her faith strengthened, she began to prepare the community for something even greater. If God did this for us, He can do more for all of us. We need to be ready to trust in Him again. The stage was set for the climax. The widow, now more confident, inspired others to believe, but also faced the resistance of those who did not want change. Everything indicated that God still had more to reveal, not only to her, but to the entire village. When the miracle confronts resistance. The atmosphere in the village was one of anticipation and tension. On one side, the widow had become a reference of faith and perseverance, inspiring the residents to believe in miracles and to care for one another. On the other side, some merchants, driven by envy and fear of losing their profits, began to organize a plan to discredit her. Everything came to a head one morning when the widow decided to hold a meeting in the center of the village. Accompanied by her children and encouraged by Elisha, she gathered the residents to share what God had done for her family. With a firm but emotional voice, she began, "When all seemed lost, God used the little I had to give me more than I could have imagined. This isn't about oil or jars. It's about trusting in a God who sees what is empty and fills it with His grace." While many residents listened attentively, the merchants who envied her took the opportunity to confront her. One of them, known for being arrogant, stood up in the middle of the crowd and said, "Why should we believe that this was God? It could just be luck or a trick. You are deceiving people to look more important." The crowd fell silent, divided between those who trusted the widow's testimony and those who began to doubt. At that moment, Elisha stood up and with authority replied, "You are questioning the power of God, but you know deep in your hearts that what happened here was not human work. If you still doubt, ask God to show His glory once again." A challenge was thrown, and the merchants, now suspicious, decided to confront Elisha directly. "If this God is so powerful, why doesn't He fill more jars in front of all of us now?" Elisha calmly looked at the widow and said, "The miracle has already been given. It is not a demonstration to prove something to you, but a lesson for those who have faith. However, God always honors those who trust in Him." At that moment, an unexpected event happened. One of the merchants who had criticized the widow looked at one of his own jars and saw oil overflowing. Even though no one had touched it, he fell to his knees, recognizing the power of God. This triggered a commotion in the crowd, and many began to cry out for forgiveness, confessing their own doubts and mistakes. The climax of the story was not just the miracle of the oil, but the transformation of hardened hearts. The widow, who had been the target of criticism and envy, now became a symbol of how faith can change lives and communities, a legacy of faith and transformation. The impact of the oil miracle and the events that followed echoed throughout the village and beyond. The merchants, previously driven by greed, fell silent after witnessing the power of God. Many of them, including those who had risen up against the widow, changed their attitudes and began to act with more compassion, offering fair prices and help to the needy. For the widow, the transformation was more than financial. She was no longer just a woman struggling to survive. Now, she was seen as a spiritual leader and an example of faith. The story of how God used the little she had to perform a great miracle became an inspiration not only for her community, but also for neighboring villages that heard about what happened. Eliab and Joel, her sons, grew up with a new outlook on life. Eliab decided to follow in Elisha's footsteps, dedicating himself to the service of God. He accompanied the prophet on his travels, learning valuable lessons of humility, faith, and leadership. Joel, in turn, stayed by his mother's side, helping her with the olive trees and dedicating himself to teaching other children about the importance of trusting in God, even in difficult times. The network of solidarity started by the widow continued to grow. The jars that were once empty now symbolized not only the miracle, but also the generosity that began to circulate among the residents. People began to share what they had, helping widows, orphans, and others in need. Elisha, before leaving, left a powerful message for the village. The miracle was not just for one woman, but for all of you. God uses what we offer Him, however small it may seem, to show us that His provision never fails. The widow kept one of the jars as a reminder of the day her life changed forever. She knew that the oil was not just a resource, but a symbol of God's faithfulness. Whenever she looked at that jar, she remembered how obedience, even in the midst of doubt, had brought abundance to her life. Years later, the village was known not for its crisis or poverty, but as a place where the goodness of God had been manifested. People who once lived in fear now lived with hope, inspired by the testimony of the widow and her family. The miracle of the oil not only paid off a debt, but left an eternal legacy of faith and transformation. The lesson of the oil that never dried up. Years passed since the miracle of the oil, but the story remained alive in the hearts and conversations of the village. The widow, now an elderly woman, still cared for the olive trees she had planted with the resources from the miracle. Her hands were more calloused, but her heart remained full of gratitude. Each new harvest was a reminder that God not only meets our immediate needs, but also prepares a future beyond what we can imagine. Eliab, now an adult man, had become a traveling prophet, following in Elisha's footsteps. He visited villages and cities, telling his family's story and encouraging others to trust in God. The oil was not the end point, he would say. It was the beginning of something greater, the transformation of lives through faith. Joel, the younger brother, also grew up with the story of the miracle as the foundation for his life. He became a respected merchant, known for his honesty and generosity. His oil business thrived, but he never forgot his origins. Joel made a point of distributing oil for free to the needy, saying, "God did for us, now we do for others." The village, which had once faced hunger and scarcity, had become a place of abundance. People learned to trust more in God and in each other, creating a united and prosperous community. The widow's story was passed down from generation to generation, not as a distant tale, but as a practical reminder that faith can move mountains. And what about the widow? She kept one of the original jars from the miracle in a special place in her home. Whenever someone visited her, she told the story, emphasizing not the oil, but the God who multiplies the little we offer Him. With eyes shining with emotion, she would say, "It doesn't matter how small your offering is. In God's hands, it can change the world." The final lesson of the story was clear. The miracle of the oil was not just about provision, but about transformation. It was about learning to see the impossible through the eyes of faith. And that lesson transcended time, echoing in every heart that heard the widow's testimony. The oil was gone, the jars emptied, but the faith and impact of that miracle remained forever. The miracle that taught to trust. The story of the widow and the oil challenges us to look at our own lives and ask, what are we giving to God? Often we get caught up in what seems insufficient, our resources, abilities, or even our faith. But this story reminds us that God is not limited by what we have or by who we are. He is able to do the impossible as long as we are willing to trust and obey. Imagine what might have happened if the widow had given up. She might have ignored the call to seek Elisha or refused to ask her neighbors for jars. Her doubt and fear could have prevented the miracle. However, even with uncertainties, she chose to obey. That decision changed everything. This teaches us that obedience is often the starting point for seeing God's provision. But the miracle goes beyond material provision. It reveals the character of God, a loving Father who cares for His children, who transforms the little into much, and who multiplies what we give Him. The story of the oil shows that true prosperity is not just in what we receive, but in what we do with it. The widow did not keep the oil just for herself. She used the blessing to bless others, creating a network of solidarity and hope in her community. And what about us? How many times do we look at our jars and think they are empty? Maybe it's our time, our strength, or our courage that seems insufficient. But God invites us to bring what we have and trust in Him to do the rest. He doesn't ask us for perfection, just a willing heart. This story also reminds us that miracles don't always happen in a grand or instantaneous way. Sometimes they start with something as simple as a little oil. It is up to us to follow the steps that God shows us, even when we don't fully understand the plan. Today, perhaps you are facing a moment of scarcity, doubt, or fear. Remember the widow. Remember the God who multiplies. The same God who acted in that simple house continues to act today. He still uses the small things to perform great miracles. So, what are your jars? What can you give to God today? It may seem small, but in His hands, it may be exactly what you and others around you need, sharing the miracle with the world. In concluding this story, it becomes clear that the miracle of the oil was not just for the widow and her family, but a testimony that echoed in many lives. Now, the question turns to you. What is your oil? What has God placed in your hands to trust Him with? Just as the widow needed to take the first step, perhaps today you are being called to do the same. It could be a simple act, like offering a little of your time, believing that God can multiply your resources, or making a decision based on faith, even without fully understanding what will come. This story reminds us that God never asks for what we cannot give. He takes the little, or even nothing, that we have and transforms it into something extraordinary. So, don't wait until you have everything perfect. Start with what you have, exactly where you are. Let this message be an encouragement to you and those around you. If this story spoke to your heart, please share it with someone who also needs to hear it. Perhaps you know someone who is facing an empty jar in their life, someone who needs to be reminded that God is a God of provision. In the comments, tell us, what was a time when you saw God act in your life in an unexpected way? Or perhaps, what is the jar that you feel you need to surrender to Him today? Your story can inspire others to take steps of faith. Don't forget that you are part of something bigger. Every decision to trust and obey not only impacts your life, but also those around you. Just as the widow became an example in her community, you can be a light to others. Finally, subscribe to the channel for more reimagined and impactful stories. We don't want you to miss the next episode, where we'll explore another powerful biblical story. Imagine what would have happened if Peter hadn't stepped out of the boat when he saw Jesus walking on the water. Would he have missed the opportunity to experience the supernatural? Stay with us to find out. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Trust, obey, and allow Him to transform your story.